Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Citrus Bites. As we head towards the next UK budget that the Chancellor will hold on the 26th of November, I thought it would be good to spend a little bit more time just focused on the UK for both today's bites and next month's bites. So as we understand what are the DARs the Chancellor is likely to be looking at when making sure that the policy she's going to announce and the fiscal changes come November fit with what the UK needs. So I thought I'd start with some of the principles I remember from my time in a bank, which was typically if you're lending money, you price it based on the risk you're facing. So as a borrower, if you're wanting to borrow money, if you present a greater risk, you're going to have to pay more to borrow that money. And the second point being that really, although debt can be good in the right circumstances, having a plan to repay the debt, whatever that plan might be, is also quite sensible. So thinking about those two things, Rachel Reeves last time announced some changes to try and actually deal with our current UK public sector debt. So for those that don't remember, and it's something that is being talked about a lot, the current UK public sector debt stands at a rather ginormous £3 trillion. Now, I put some in context because actually in the US right now, their public sector debt stands at more like $36 trillion. So it's a bit relative to the size of the economy in the country and lots of other factors. But nonetheless, as you can see from this chart, this debt is going up year by year by year. So the plans announced are to try and tackle and start to address the UK debt. So for those that don't remember, the Chancellor announced a couple of measures to be able to do that, one of which was employers' national insurance contributions going up, the other being some changes to minimum wage. So a few changes to try and help address the debt. And I thought I'd start with the most recent announcement that confirms, are those changes making a difference now to that current debt level? So data showed the UK government net borrowing in August 2025 rose to 1796 billion. So that probably sounds a rather large number. If you're imagining running a current account and you've just gone 17.96 billion overdrawn, and that is up from 2.82 billion in July, and up year on year from 14.24 billion. So it's actually the loftiest August borrowing figure for 5 years by the public sector. So borrowing in the financial year to August 2025 was 83.8 billion, 16 billion more than the same 5-month period of 2024, and the second highest April to August borrowing since monthly records began in 1993. That's quite staggering when you think that the plan actually put in place right now was to tackle this debt. So we have 3 trillion and it's going up. So one of the challenges faced obviously is how much of that borrowing that needs to be paid back is now an interest figure. So one of the important things will be to try and stem the interest having to be paid by keeping interest rates controlled as low as possible, high quality government lending so that they can lend at a low rate when they're trying to attract money. So the plan being with national insurance and the plan being with things like minimum wage. The question is then, how have employers reacted to that? And perhaps one of the best sort of ways of measuring that will be to look at our inflation. So employers faced with this additional cost to look at, actually what we're starting to see now is, have they actually passed that on to consumers? So the most recent inflation, the CPI inflation data coming in on a 12-month basis to August shows inflation going up at 3.8%. Again, remember the original Bank of England kind of benchmark for that, what they'd like to see is typically at 2%. There's been announced that it won't be at 2% for a while. It's going to run above that. The scaring thing is that this inflation line just seems to keep going up. So we've got prices potentially continually going up. Employers saying, actually, these extra costs that we've got to incur, we're going to pass those on to consumers. So consumers will have noticed this. What's going up? Well, food being one of the biggest culprits in August. And some of these are really staple foods for people: vegetables, eggs, milk, cheese, beef, So these are things that for many people are staples, as I say. So those prices going up uh, will be a direct result of employers and manufacturers trying to work out how to absorb these extra costs they're incurring. And then I suppose you go, well, if that's what's happening in the UK, is the UK particularly unique compared to other countries? So for those that didn't hear, the US in August, actually September rather, announced their central bank lending rate was going down. So how are they managing to do that? And the EU again, so looking at what they're doing. So I thought it might just be useful. There is one sort of similar comparison inflationary rate that's used both across Europe and the US. So that's called, the initials are HICP. It's basically a harmonized inflation figure that provides a more accurate way of comparing the inflation figures across the countries. And again, so what you can see here is that although a number of countries have talked about the scale of the government debt, plans they're putting in place to address it, actually, for a number of countries, they're managing to do that whilst keeping inflation in check. The UK is beginning to look like a real outliner when it comes to what's happening with inflation. And the difficulty with this particular problem for the Chancellor is it's all making the debt more expensive. So it means the government are having to pay more for the money that's been borrowed. More of the money they were hoping to use to bring the debt down is having to go towards covering just the interest payments on the debt. And that is putting a real challenge on the fiscal policy that the Chancellor announced. So right now, these dials are not going in the direction the Chancellor would have wanted them to go at all. So all of that played into the most recent Bank of England base rate announcement. I don't think there was any surprises. We saw a slight drop in August. Bank of England base rate dropped by 25 basis points. In September, it was held flat. Frankly, the Monetary Policy Committee voted 7-2, I think it was, in order to keep rates flat. They had very little choice. Given the inflation data, really, there was nowhere for them to go with rates. They certainly couldn't put them down, given all the information that they could see. And so the final bit for me today, having talked about all of that really positive news, was then to touch on what the figure I probably talk about the most in Citrus Bites, which is the unemployment figure. So why do I talk about that one so much? I do try and say this is because I'm a great believer that fundamentally money in people's pockets, it means that there's more tax revenue coming into the government. B, obviously will help reduce the pressure slightly on the welfare position that the government faces. So unemployment not being high is something the government will want to keep an eye on. As you can see, it is continuing to creep up, now facing a figure of about 4.7 million. Actually, that is broadly kind of when you compare it across the history, exclude the financial crisis, because when you look back to 2008, 2009, 2010, and in the financial crisis, and actually a slight kind of spike, obviously, during COVID, you can see that we're running really at 4.7 million, kind of an average over the last 10 to 15 years if you take the spike out. So unemployment's creeping up gradually. And the reason that matters, remember, we talk about how much employers are looking to pay when it comes to pay increases. They'll be factoring in things like, yes, the direct costs that they're facing. They'll be looking at the inflationary pressure that their team members are facing. So this is how much do we need to pay our team members to make sure A, we're competitive, but B, they can maintain a standard of living. And then it's about how many people are there on the job market to be able to choose from. So it's a really delicate balance with all these things the government's trying to navigate. Right now, unemployment continues to go up. That will be worrying. Inflation continuing to go up. That will be worrying. So not a great news story that the Chancellor is facing with just a couple of months to go until that all-important budget. Hopefully, when I come to see you next time, I'll have something a bit more positive. I always think it's about bringing the open honesty of the situation, and we'll get to see kind of how do those dials look when we're about 4 weeks out from the budget in November. So that's it for today. Thanks ever so much for watching. Look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care and bye for now.